Hi, I'm Emma Rodriguez. I sat down at what was supposed to be our family dinner, and my stepmother Patricia placed a plate in front of me that made my stomach turn. The pasta was covered in green fuzzy mold. The sauce had separated into chunky, sour-smelling clumps, and there were actual black spots growing on what used to be garlic bread. Meanwhile, she served everyone else perfectly grilled lobster tails with drawn butter and fresh asparagus. "Eat up, sweetheart," she said with that sickeningly sweet voice she reserved for her cruelest moments. "We can't afford to waste food, especially not for someone who doesn't contribute anything to this household." What Patricia didn't know, as she watched me stare at that disgusting plate, was that the girl she considered worthless was actually the sole owner of the Five restaurant chain that had been secretly funding their entire lavish lifestyle for the past 3 years. And that moldy dinner was about to become the most expensive meal they never imagined they'd have to pay for. Because while they saw me as nothing more than an unwanted burden my father had dragged into their perfect little family, I was the one whose bank account had been keeping their Mercedes payments current, their mortgage up to date, and their country club memberships active. They were about to learn that when you bite the hand that feeds you, sometimes that hand stops feeding altogether. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Rodriguez family mansion in Lakewood sprawled across 2 perfectly manicured acres, every blade of grass trimmed to identical height, every flower bed arranged with mathematical precision. The circular driveway could accommodate 8 cars comfortably, though tonight it held only 4. My father's black BMW sedan, Patricia's pearl-white Mercedes SUV, my stepsister Ashley's bright red Camaro that she'd received for her 18th birthday 6 months ago, and my own modest Honda Civic that looked embarrassingly out of place among the luxury vehicles. The house itself was a testament to excess, with its soaring columns, imported Italian marble entryway, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered stunning views of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. Walking through those heavy oak front doors always felt like entering a museum rather than a home. The foyer alone was larger than most people's living rooms, dominated by a crystal chandelier that Patricia had insisted cost more than some people's annual salaries. Persian rugs covered gleaming hardwood floors, and original oil paintings hung in ornate gold frames along the hallway walls. Every surface was polished to perfection, every decorative object positioned with the precision of a high-end furniture showroom. It was beautiful, impressive, and completely cold. The dining room where our family gathered each evening could easily seat 20 people around its massive mahogany table, though it typically hosted only the 4 of us. Tonight, like every night, Patricia had set the table with her finest china, crystal wine glasses that caught the light from the smaller but equally expensive chandelier overhead, and silverware that probably cost more per place setting than most families spent on groceries in a month. Fresh flowers from her prize-winning garden served as the centerpiece, their sweet fragrance mixing with the aroma of whatever gourmet meal she'd prepared for everyone except me. I took my usual seat at the far end of the table, the spot Patricia had assigned me 3 years ago when she'd redecorated and claimed I was disrupting the visual flow by sitting closer to the family. From here, I had a perfect view of the kitchen through the open archway, where commercial-grade appliances gleamed under recessed lighting. A 6-burner gas range, double convection ovens, a walk-in pantry, and a wine refrigerator that held bottles worth more than most people's cars. It was a chef's dream kitchen, equipped better than most restaurants, and Patricia used it to create elaborate meals for everyone in the family, except the one person who actually understood what those appliances were capable of. My father, David, sat at the head of the table as always, his graying hair perfectly styled, wearing one of his expensive tailored shirts even at home. At 52, he still cut an impressive figure, the kind of man who commanded respect in boardrooms and country club dining rooms. His hands moved with practiced ease as he cut into his lobster tail, barely glancing up from his plate to acknowledge my presence. This had become our normal routine over the past few years, since Patricia had gradually convinced him that family dinners should be peaceful and focused on positive energy. Apparently, acknowledging his own daughter fell outside those parameters. Ashley, my 19-year-old stepsister, sat across from her mother, her phone propped against her water glass as she live-streamed her dinner to her 47,000 Instagram followers. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, and her makeup looked professionally applied, even though she'd spent the entire day lounging by the pool. She wore a designer dress that probably cost more than most people made in a week, and her nails were freshly manicured in a shade that perfectly matched her outfit. Everything about Ashley screamed privilege and entitlement, from her designer handbag casually thrown over the back of her chair to the diamond tennis bracelet glinting on her wrist. "Oh my gosh, you guys!" Ashley gushed into her phone's camera, holding up a forkful of lobster meat. "This is literally the most amazing dinner ever. Our family chef is just incredible. I'm so blessed to have such talented people taking care of us." She giggled and took a delicate bite, then continued her performance. "I keep telling everyone that good food runs in our family. It's like we just have this natural instinct for creating amazing flavors and perfect presentations." Patricia beamed with pride as she watched her daughter's social media performance, occasionally leaning into frame to wave at the camera or add her own comments about their wonderful family traditions and commitment to excellence in everything we do. At 45, Patricia maintained the kind of polished appearance that came from unlimited time and money for personal care. Her auburn hair was styled in an expensive cut that framed her face perfectly. Her makeup was flawless even at the end of the day, and her jewelry suggested someone who'd never worried about money in her entire life. What Ashley's followers didn't know, what none of Patricia's country club friends understood, was that the family chef Ashley kept referencing didn't exist. Patricia did all the cooking herself, and she was actually quite talented at it. She'd attended culinary school in her 20s before meeting and marrying Ashley's father, though that marriage had ended in divorce when Ashley was 12. She'd maintained her cooking skills over the years, treating meal preparation like a form of artistic expression, especially when she had an audience to impress. But her artistry apparently didn't extend to everyone at the table. The plate she'd set in front of me contained what had obviously been leftover pasta from several days ago, reheated and disguised with a few wilted herbs sprinkled on top. The fettuccine noodles had that slimy texture that comes from being stored too long, and the cream sauce had separated into an unappetizing mixture of congealed fat and sour-smelling liquid. Fuzzy green mold spots decorated the surface like some kind of twisted garnish, and the bread roll beside it had black spots that definitely hadn't been there when it was fresh. "Something wrong with your dinner, Emma?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying that particular tone of fake concern she'd perfected over the years. "You're not eating." I looked up at her, then at my father, who continued cutting his lobster without acknowledging the conversation, then at Ashley, who was still performing for her camera. "Actually, yes," I said quietly. "This food has gone bad. There's mold growing on it." Patricia's eyebrows rose in an expression of exaggerated surprise. "Mold? I don't see any mold. You're being awfully dramatic, don't you think? Food is expensive. Emma, maybe if you contributed something meaningful to this household instead of playing around in those little kitchens all day, you'd understand the value of not wasting perfectly good meals." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ashley looked up from her phone, her eyes bright with amusement. "Emma's just being picky again. She thinks she's too good for family dinner now that she's got her little cooking hobby." She turned back to her camera with a conspiratorial whisper. "My stepsister thinks she's some kind of chef because she works in restaurants. It's honestly kind of embarrassing how seriously she takes it." The comments on Ashley's live stream started pouring in immediately. Heart emojis, praise for the amazing family dinner, questions about whether Ashley had her own cooking show yet, and unfortunately, Several comments mocking the wannabe chef sister, who apparently thought she was too good for family food. Ashley read some of these aloud, giggling as she did, turning my humiliation into entertainment for her followers. My father finally looked up from his plate, his expression showing more irritation than concern. "Emma, just eat your dinner. Your stepmother worked hard preparing this meal for our family. The least you can do is show some appreciation instead of complaining." I stared at him, this man who'd raised me alone for 10 years after my mother died, who used to take me to cooking classes on Saturday mornings because I'd shown an interest in following my mother's dream of opening a restaurant someday. The man who'd promised my dying mother that he'd support my culinary ambitions and make sure I never forgot where my passion came from. Now he couldn't even see that his wife was serving me spoiled food while everyone else enjoyed a feast. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady, "look at this plate. Really look at it. Would you eat food that looks like this?" He glanced down, briefly, then back to his lobster. "It looks fine to me. You're being overly sensitive. Patricia spent a lot of time on dinner tonight." That's when something shifted inside me. Not anger exactly, though there was certainly some of that brewing. Beneath the surface. Not even hurt, though watching my father choose his new wife's feelings over his daughter's basic health and dignity definitely stung. What I felt was clarity. Crystal clear understanding of exactly where I stood in this family hierarchy and exactly what these people thought of me. I was 25 years old. I had a college degree in business administration with a minor in culinary arts. I'd spent the last 7 years building something from nothing, turning my late mother's modest life insurance payout into a thriving business empire. And yet, in this house, at this table, I was still treated like an unwanted charity case who should be grateful for moldy scraps. I stood up slowly, placing my napkin beside the untouched plate of spoiled food. "You know what? You're absolutely right about the value of money. Thanks for reminding me of that." Patricia's smile was triumphant as she watched me push back from the table. Finally, some maturity. Maybe now you'll start appreciating what this family provides for you instead of constantly complaining. Ashley was already back to her live stream, telling her followers about how family dinner drama was just part of living with creative types who thought they were too special for normal food. Her audience was eating it up, sending encouragements and heart emojis as she painted herself as the patient, understanding sister dealing with a difficult family member. I walked out of that dining room with my head held high, ignoring Ashley's continued commentary and Patricia's satisfied expression. But as I climbed the stairs toward my bedroom, my mind was already working through calculations and possibilities that none of them could have imagined. Because while they saw me as the family disappointment who couldn't even appreciate a home-cooked meal, I was actually the person whose business success had been quietly funding their entire lifestyle for the past 3 years. My bedroom was the only space in that house that truly felt like mine. It was smaller than Ashley's room, with a less impressive view, but it contained everything that mattered to me. My desk held my laptop, business files, and the framed photo of my mother from her culinary school graduation. Rosa Rodriguez had been beautiful, with dark hair and eyes that sparkled with determination and dreams. She'd worked 2 jobs to save money for her own restaurant, planning every detail from the menu to the decor, but cancer had taken her before she could make those dreams reality. When she died, she left me $50,000 and a notebook, filled with her recipes, business plans, and dreams. Everyone expected me to use that money for college tuition, or maybe put it away for someday in the distant future. Instead, I'd used it as seed money to open my first restaurant at age 18, working 16-hour days to make her vision come to life. Rosa's kitchen had started as a tiny storefront in a strip mall, serving simple comfort food made with the recipes my mother had perfected over years of experimentation. I opened my laptop and logged into the business banking system, pulling up the accounts that told the real story of the Rodriguez family finances. Rosa's kitchen had grown from that single storefront into 5 successful locations across Colorado. The flagship restaurant in downtown Denver seated 200 and had a 3-week waiting list for weekend reservations. The second location in Boulder catered to the college crowd and local tech workers. The third, in Colorado Springs, had become a destination for tourists visiting Pikes Peak. The fourth, in Fort Collins, specialized in farm-to-table cuisine using local ingredients. The fifth, in Aspen, served an upscale clientele during ski season and mountain hiking season. Together, these 5 restaurants generated annual revenue of over $2.3 million. After expenses, payroll, and reinvestment in equipment and improvements, my personal take-home was approximately $38,000 per month. It wasn't tech billionaire money, but it was solid, sustainable income from businesses I'd built with my own hands and vision. But here's what made those numbers particularly interesting. For the past 3 years, I'd been transferring $25,000 per month from my business account into what I'd thought was a family emergency fund. My father had convinced me it was important to have shared resources available for unexpected expenses, home improvements, or family emergencies. What I'd discovered only recently was that this emergency fund had become the primary source of income for our households. Major expenses. I pulled up the detailed transaction history and began scrolling through 3 years of payments. The mortgage on this Lakewood mansion, $4,800 per month, automatically deducted from the account I'd been funding. Patricia's Mercedes lease, $850 monthly. Ashley's car payment, $620. The country club membership that Patricia and Ashley used for their social activities, $350 monthly. Ashley's college tuition, $12,000 per semester. Patricia's spa treatments, shopping expeditions, and what she called household management expenses, averaging about $3,000 monthly. The math was staggering. Over 3 years, I'd transferred a total of $900,000 into that family account. Nearly $1 million of my restaurant profits had gone toward supporting a lifestyle that these people now took completely for granted, while treating me like an unwanted burden who should be grateful for. Spoiled food. My father's actual income came from what he called his investment portfolio, but a closer look at those numbers revealed a troubling pattern. His stock picks had been losing money steadily for the past 2 years. His consulting work, which he'd claimed was bringing in substantial income, actually generated less than $4,000 per month. Without my monthly contributions, the Rodriguez family's household income would have been completely insufficient to maintain even a modest middle-class lifestyle, let alone the luxury they'd become accustomed to. I sat back in my desk chair, staring at these numbers on my laptop screen, feeling a mixture of disbelief and growing determination. For 3 years, I'd been essentially paying for the privilege of being treated like garbage in my own family. The people who fed me moldy food while enjoying fresh lobster were living entirely off the success of the business empire I'd built from my mother's dreams and my own relentless work. But what made it even worse was the way they'd been representing my success to the outside world. I opened Ashley's Instagram account and began scrolling through months of posts that made my stomach turn. Photo after photo showed her posing in my restaurants, wearing chef's coats, standing behind cooking stations, with captions that implied she was deeply involved in the family restaurant business. One post from 2 weeks ago showed her in the kitchen of my flagship location, holding a plate of my signature dish, with the caption, "Another successful day developing new menu items for our family's restaurant empire. Blessed to be working with such an amazing team. Chef life. Family business. Young entrepreneur. Blessed." The post had over 3,000 likes and hundreds of comments praising her incredible talent and inspiring work ethic. Food bloggers had shared it, local magazines had reached out for interviews, and several cooking schools had contacted her about potential speaking engagements. Ashley had built an entire social media brand around taking credit for my work, my restaurants, and my success. Even worse, Patricia had been actively spreading stories throughout their social circle about how the restaurants were a family venture that she'd helped plan and finance. She'd told people at the country club that I was merely the day-to-day manager while she handled the real business decisions behind the scenes. She'd positioned herself as the experienced adult guiding a young person's career, rather than acknowledging that her stepdaughter had built something impressive entirely independently. The lies had become so elaborate and widespread that several people in their social circle had approached me at community events to compliment Patricia on her business acumen and mentorship skills. Local business magazines had tried to interview her about supporting young entrepreneurs and family business dynamics. She'd even been invited to speak at a women's entrepreneurship conference about nurturing the next generation of business leaders. All of this recognition and social status was built on taking credit for my work, while simultaneously treating me like hired help, who should be grateful for spoiled leftovers. The irony was so thick it was almost funny, except that it wasn't funny at all. It was theft. Theft of credit, theft of recognition, theft of the narrative about my own life and achievements. I closed the laptop and walked to my bedroom window, looking out over the perfectly manicured backyard where Patricia's garden bloomed with expensive flowers, and Ashley's friends often gathered for pool parties funded by my restaurant profits. The evening sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Tomorrow was going to be different. Not dramatically different, not explosively different, but quietly and strategically different. Because while they'd been busy taking credit for my success and treating me like their personal ATM, I'd been learning something valuable about the restaurant business that they clearly didn't understand. The person who controls the money controls everything else. And it was time for them to learn exactly who had been controlling their money all along. The next morning arrived with unusual quiet in the Rodriguez household. Patricia typically started her days with loud phone conversations to her sister in California, discussing everything from local gossip to her latest shopping discoveries. Ashley usually blasted music from her room while getting ready for another day of what she called content creation, but looked more like elaborate photo shoots around the house and pool. My father generally left early for his office, where he spent most days managing investments that weren't performing nearly as well as he claimed. But today, something felt different as I made my way downstairs to the kitchen. The house carried an almost expectant silence, as if even the walls understood that change was coming. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and thinking through possibilities, consequences, and the careful steps I would need to take to reclaim control of my own life and success. I made coffee using the expensive espresso machine that Patricia had insisted they needed, another purchase funded by my monthly transfers. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood in this chef's dream kitchen, surrounded by equipment that most restaurant owners would envy, preparing my morning caffeine in the same space where my stepmother had served me moldy food just 12 hours earlier. The kitchen truly was magnificent, I had to admit. Commercial-grade everything, from the 6-burner gas range with double ovens to the walk-in pantry stocked with ingredients that cost more per pound than most people spent on entire meals. The marble countertops gleamed under carefully positioned lighting, and the custom cabinetry held dishes and serving pieces that Patricia collected like some people collected art. It was a space designed for someone who took cooking seriously, who understood the craft and artistry involved in creating memorable meals, which made Patricia's decision to serve me spoiled food even more pointed and deliberate. She hadn't run out of ingredients. She hadn't been pressed for time. She'd had everything she needed to prepare fresh, delicious food for everyone at that table. Instead, she'd chosen to give me something that could have made me seriously ill while everyone else enjoyed a restaurant-quality meal. As I sipped my coffee and listened to the house slowly come to life around me, I realized that last night's dinner hadn't been about food at all. It had been about power. Patricia's way of reminding me exactly where I stood in her carefully constructed hierarchy. The stepchild who should be grateful for whatever scraps were offered, who should accept humiliation with grace, who should never forget that her place in this family was entirely dependent on others' charity and goodwill. What Patricia didn't understand was that the power dynamic she thought she was reinforcing was actually completely backward. She believed she was the queen of this castle, dispensing favor and punishment as she saw fit. She thought my father's love and financial support gave her unlimited authority over everyone in the household. She assumed that her social connections and carefully cultivated reputation made her untouchable. But queens only have power as long as their kingdoms can sustain them. And this particular kingdom had been built entirely on the financial foundation. I'd been providing without them even realizing it. Remove that foundation, and the whole elaborate structure would collapse surprisingly quickly. I heard Patricia's heels clicking on the hardwood floors as she made her way toward the kitchen, probably planning to start her daily routine of multiple phone calls and online shopping sessions. She appeared in the doorway wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her hair already perfectly styled despite the early hour, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who never allowed herself to be, seen looking less than flawless. "Oh, Emma, you're up early," she said, her voice carrying that tone of mild surprise she used when she wanted to suggest that my presence was unexpected or slightly inconvenient. "I hope you weren't planning to use the kitchen this morning. I have a very busy day ahead, and I need to prepare some special appetizers for the book club meeting this afternoon." I looked at her over my coffee cup, noting how she'd positioned herself in the doorway as if to block my access to the rest of the kitchen. "Don't worry, Patricia. I was just finishing my coffee. I have a very busy day ahead, too." She moved past me toward the refrigerator, opening it to survey the contents with the air of someone planning a military campaign. Good. I'm glad. You're staying busy with your little restaurant activities. It's important for young people to have hobbies and interests, even if they're not particularly profitable." The casual dismissal of my business empire as little restaurant activities and hobbies hit exactly the way she'd intended it to. Patricia had perfected this particular skill over the 3 years since she'd married my father. She could deliver devastating insults wrapped in seemingly caring observations, making it difficult to object without appearing oversensitive or ungrateful. "Actually," I said, setting down my coffee cup and watching her pull expensive ingredients from the refrigerator, "the restaurants have been quite profitable. In fact, I've been meaning to talk to Dad about some changes to our family financial arrangements." Patricia paused in her ingredient gathering, glancing at me with an expression that was trying very hard to appear casual and unconcerned. "Changes? What kind of changes? I hope you're not planning to ask for more money. Your father has been quite generous supporting your culinary experiments, and we do have our own expenses to consider." The sheer audacity of that statement took my breath away. Patricia was standing in a kitchen paid for by my culinary experiments, wearing clothes bought with money from my restaurants, living in a house whose mortgage I'd been covering, and she had the nerve to suggest that I was the one asking for financial support from them. "Oh no," I said, smiling in a way that I hoped looked entirely innocent. "Quite the opposite, actually. I've been doing some analysis of my business finances, and I think there are some opportunities for better capital allocation. Money that's been going toward family support might be better invested in expansion plans." I watched Patricia's face carefully as she processed this information. She was smart enough to understand the implications, but arrogant enough to believe that any threats from me were ultimately empty. In her mind, I was still the grief-stricken teenager who'd been grateful for her father's new wife's guidance and support. She couldn't conceive of a world where I might have grown into someone with real power and independence. "Well," she said, returning her attention to the ingredients spread across the marble countertop, "I'm sure your father will help you make whatever decisions are best for everyone involved. He's always been so good at managing complex financial situations." It was another perfectly crafted dismissal. The suggestion that I wasn't capable of making my own financial decisions, that my father would naturally override any plans I might have, that my opinions and preferences were ultimately subject to adult supervision. Patricia had elevated this kind of subtle psychological manipulation to an art form. I finished my coffee and rinsed the cup in the sink, taking my time and watching her begin preparation for her book club appetizers. She moved around the kitchen with genuine skill and confidence, chopping vegetables with professional precision, seasoning ingredients by taste rather than measurement, multitasking with the efficiency of someone who understood cooking at a deep level, which made her treatment of me even more deliberately cruel. Patricia knew good food from bad food. She understood the difference between fresh ingredients and spoiled ones. Her decision to serve me moldy pasta hadn't been careless or accidental. It had been a calculated choice designed to humiliate and degrade me while demonstrating her power over my daily experience in this house. "Those look like they're going to be delicious," I said, nodding toward her appetizer preparations. "Your book club friends are lucky to have someone with your skills providing the food." Patricia preened slightly at the compliment, exactly as I'd expected her to. "Thank you, dear. I do try to maintain certain standards. It's important to show people that you care about quality and presentation." "Absolutely," I agreed. Quality and presentation say so much about a person's character and values. I left the kitchen and headed upstairs to get ready for my own day, but not before catching the slight frown that crossed Patricia's face as she processed my comment. She was smart enough to recognize that my words might have carried more meaning than their surface suggested, but not quite paranoid enough to worry about what I might actually be planning. In my bedroom, I opened my laptop and began working through the practical steps of what I'd decided to call financial restructuring. The first step was to contact my business attorney, Lisa Chang, and schedule an emergency meeting to discuss changing my personal financial arrangements. Lisa had been my legal counsel since I'd opened the second Rose's Kitchen location, and she understood both my business structure and my family situation well enough to provide realistic guidance. The second step was to call Jake Thompson, my general manager, and arrange a comprehensive review of all 5 restaurant locations. If I was going to stop subsidizing my family's lifestyle, I wanted to make sure my businesses were positioned for maximum profitability and growth. The money that had been going toward Patricia's shopping expeditions and Ashley's car payments could be redirected toward the expansion plans I'd been postponing for months. The third step, and perhaps the most important one, was to document everything. Every financial transfer, every social media post where Ashley took credit for my work, every conversation where Patricia had misrepresented my role in the restaurant business to her social circle. I had a feeling that when this situation finally reached its conclusion, having a complete record of facts and evidence would be crucial. I spent the next 2 hours making phone calls and reviewing documents, building a comprehensive picture of how my money had been flowing and where it needed to go instead. By the time I heard Ashley's music starting from her room and my father's car pulling out of the driveway for his commute to the office, I had a clear plan of action that would begin today and unfold over the next several weeks. The beautiful thing about this plan was its simplicity. I wasn't plotting elaborate revenge or dramatic confrontations. I was simply taking control of my own financial resources and redirecting them toward my own goals instead of other people's lifestyles. The consequences for my family would be entirely natural results of their own choices and assumptions. They'd built their entire standard of living on money they thought belonged to them or came from sources they controlled. When that money stopped flowing, they'd have to confront the reality of their actual financial situation. No drama, no shouting matches, no emotional manipulation, just basic economics and the laws of cause and effect. Answer Part 3. Recognition of True Position. My meeting with Lisa Chang took place in her downtown Denver office, a sleek space on the 30th floor of a glass tower that offered panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains. Lisa had built her practice, representing small business owners and entrepreneurs, particularly women who were navigating the complexities of rapid business growth, while managing family relationships and social expectations that often didn't align with their professional success. She greeted me with her characteristic directness, pouring coffee from an expensive machine while gesturing for me to settle into one of the leather chairs facing her desk. "Emma, you sounded stressed on the phone yesterday. What's going on with the family situation?" I'd worked with Lisa long enough to appreciate her no-nonsense approach to both legal and personal problems. She didn't waste time with small talk or gentle emotional cushioning. She wanted facts, context, and clear objectives so she could provide practical solutions. This morning, I was grateful for that efficiency. "I need to completely restructure my personal finances," I told her, pulling out the folder of documents I'd prepared. "For the past 3 years, I've been transferring $25,000 monthly from my business accounts into what I thought was a family emergency fund. I recently discovered that this money has been funding my stepmother and stepsister's entire lifestyle, while they've been treating me like hired help and taking public credit for my business success." Lisa's eyebrows rose as she began reviewing the bank statements and transaction records I'd brought. She was quiet for several minutes, scrolling through months of transfers and expenditures, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. Finally, she looked up with an expression that was part amazement and part professional concern. "Emma, you've essentially been paying these people nearly $300,000 per year to live in a house where they serve you spoiled food. And according to these social media screenshots, your stepsister has built her entire public persona around claiming ownership of your restaurants." "That's exactly right," I confirmed, "and I want it to stop. Today, if possible." Lisa leaned back in her chair, considering the situation from multiple angles. "Legally, this is straightforward. The money is yours, the businesses are yours, and you have every right to redirect your resources however you choose. But practically, this is going to create significant disruption in your family's household finances. Are you prepared for the conflict that's likely to result?" I thought about Patricia's satisfied smile as she'd watched me stare at that plate of moldy pasta, about Ashley's casual lies to 47,000 Instagram followers, about my father's complete indifference to my obvious humiliation. I'm prepared for whatever comes. These people have been living off my success while actively undermining me. They can figure out how to support themselves. All right then. Lisa opened her laptop and began typing. Let's start with the practical steps. First, we'll set up new business accounts that are completely separate from any family access. Second, we'll draft formal cease and desist letters regarding the unauthorized use of your business name and reputation on social media. Third, we'll document everything in case this escalates to litigation. We spent the next hour working through the technical details of separating my business finances from my family's personal expenses. Lisa helped me understand the legal protections I had as a business owner and the steps I could take to prevent further misrepresentation of my restaurants and achievements. The most interesting discovery came when Lisa pulled up the official business registration records for Rosa's Kitchen LLC. According to state filings, I was listed as the sole owner and operator of all 5 restaurant locations. There were no other names on any of the legal documents, no indication that anyone else had contributed capital or management oversight, no basis for anyone else to claim ownership or decision-making authority. "Emma," Lisa said, showing me the computer screen, "your family members have zero legal connection to your business empire. Patricia isn't listed anywhere in your corporate structure. Ashley has no official role in any of your restaurants. Even your father's name doesn't appear on any of these documents. From a legal standpoint, they're complete strangers to your business operations." This information was somehow both obvious and shocking. Of course, they had no legal claim to my restaurants. I'd built everything myself using my own money and my own credit. But seeing it laid out in official documents made their casual appropriation of my success seem even more outrageous and absurd. "What about the money I've been transferring to the family account?" I asked. Can they claim that creates some kind of financial obligation or partnership arrangement? Lisa shook her head. Personal gifts or family support don't create business partnerships or ownership stakes. You've been voluntarily providing financial assistance to your family, but that doesn't give them any legal rights to your business assets or decisions. You can stop those transfers anytime you choose, and they have no legal recourse. By the time I left Lisa's office, I had a comprehensive action plan and a much clearer understanding of exactly how much power I actually held in this situation. The people who'd been treating me like an unwanted burden were entirely dependent on my continued generosity for their lifestyle and social status. Remove that generosity, and their whole elaborate performance would collapse. My next stop was the flagship Rose's Kitchen location in downtown Denver. The lunch rush was just beginning as I walked through the dining room, and I felt the familiar satisfaction of watching customers enjoy food prepared according to my mother's recipes and my own refinements. The servers moved efficiently between tables, the kitchen operated with smooth precision, and the overall atmosphere was exactly what I'd envisioned when I'd first started planning this expansion from a single storefront to a multi-location operation. Jake Thompson was in his office reviewing the day's scheduling when I knocked on his door. At 32, Jake had more restaurant management experience than anyone else I'd worked with, having started as a server in college and worked his way up through every position in the industry. He understood both the business side and the operational side of running successful restaurants, and he'd been instrumental in helping me maintain consistent quality and service across all 5 locations. Emma, perfect timing, he said, looking up from his computer screen. I was just reviewing the numbers from last month, and we had our best June ever. Revenue up 18% from last year. Customer satisfaction scores holding steady above 4.7 stars, and our costs are actually down slightly thanks to the new supplier relationships Maria negotiated. I settled into the chair across from his desk, feeling genuinely proud of what we'd built together. That's fantastic news, Jake. Actually, that's partly why I'm here. I want to talk about acceleration, our expansion timeline. Jake's eyes lit up with interest. The 6th location? I thought we were waiting until next year to start seriously looking at new markets. Change of plans, I said. I'm redirecting some capital that was previously going toward family expenses. We should have an additional $300,000 annually available for growth investments. I watched Jake process this information, and I could see him mentally calculating what that kind of additional capital could mean for our expansion plans. We'd been conservative with growth specifically because I'd been supporting my family's lifestyle, which had limited the amount of profit I could reinvest in the business. Emma, that's incredible, he said. With that kind of additional investment, we could probably open 2 new locations within the next 18 months. I've been keeping an eye on some potential sites in Durango and Grand Junction that would give us coverage in markets we haven't penetrated yet. We spent the next hour reviewing expansion possibilities, staffing requirements, and the operational systems we'd need to implement to maintain quality control across a larger network of restaurants. Jake had clearly been thinking about these possibilities for months, waiting for the financial resources to make them realistic. There's one more thing, I said as our meeting was winding down. I need you to make sure that no one from my family has any access to our restaurants for social media content. If Ashley shows up wanting to take photos or videos, she's not authorized to represent Rose's Kitchen in any way. Jake frowned slightly. Has that been a problem? I thought she was involved in the marketing side of things. She's not involved in any aspect of our business operations, I said firmly. She's been taking unauthorized photos and videos, then posting them on social media with false claims about her role in developing recipes and managing operations. It needs to stop immediately. Understood, Jake said, making a note in his calendar. I'll make sure all our managers know that family members aren't authorized for promotional activities unless you're personally present to approve it. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing for months. Instead of dreading family dinner and another evening of subtle humiliation, I was looking forward to beginning the process of reclaiming control over my own life and success. The people who'd been taking credit for my work while treating me like hired help were about to discover exactly who had been making their comfortable lifestyle possible. The Rodriguez mansion looked different as I pulled into the circular driveway that evening. Not physically different, but somehow less impressive now that I understood exactly where the money had come from to maintain its perfect landscaping and luxurious appointments. This house wasn't a symbol of my father's business success or Patricia's sophisticated taste. It was a monument to my restaurant empire, paid for by customers who appreciated my mother's recipes and my own dedication to excellent food and service. Inside, I could hear Ashley's voice echoing from the dining room as she set up for another live-stream dinner performance. Patricia was in the kitchen, preparing what smelled like an elaborate meal for everyone except me. My father was probably in his study, reviewing investment reports that showed continued losses while remaining blissfully unaware that his household's financial stability depended entirely on his daughter's business success. Tomorrow, the education process would begin, not through confrontation or emotional appeals, but through the simple application of market principles to family relationships. They were about to learn that when you bite the hand that feeds you, sometimes that hand decides to feed someone else instead. Part 4, Initial Investigation Phase. The next morning brought the first small signs of change, though no one in the Rodriguez household was perceptive enough to notice them yet. I'd woken up early to implement the first phase of what Lisa Chung and I had planned the day before, quietly redirecting the automatic transfers that had been funding my family's lifestyle for the past 3 years. From my laptop in my bedroom, I logged into the business banking system and modified the monthly transfer settings. Instead of $25,000 flowing into the family account, that money would now go directly into a new business expansion fund that Lisa had helped me establish. The change would take effect immediately, but the family probably wouldn't notice until they tried to make their next major purchases, or until the automatic payments for their various luxury expenses started bouncing. I also sent formal notifications to all 5 Rose's kitchen locations, instructing managers and staff that Ashley Rodriguez was not authorized to conduct any filming or photography on restaurant premises, and that any requests for promotional activities involving family members should be directed to me personally for approval. Jake had promised to make sure this message was clearly communicated to everyone who might encounter Ashley during one of her impromptu content creation sessions. The breakfast routine proceeded normally, with Patricia preparing fresh fruit and gourmet coffee for everyone except me. She set a bowl of what appeared to be several-day-old cereal in front of my usual place, the milk smelling slightly sour when I leaned close enough to detect it. Ashley was already at the table with her phone propped up, recording herself eating fresh pastries while talking about her amazing family's commitment to starting every day with beautiful, nurturing food. My father sat at the head of the table, reading financial news on his tablet, occasionally commenting on market movements or investment opportunities. He seemed genuinely unaware that the comfortable lifestyle surrounding him was entirely dependent on businesses he'd never visited and success he'd played no role in creating. "Emma, you're not eating again," Patricia observed with that familiar tone of false concern. "I'm starting to worry about your appetite. Maybe you should see a doctor about these eating issues you've been having." The implication that my refusal to consume spoiled food represented some kind of psychological or medical problem was particularly creative, even by Patricia's standards. She was reframing my entirely reasonable rejection of unsafe food as evidence of mental instability, while positioning herself as the caring stepmother concerned about my well-being. "Actually, I feel great," I said, pushing the bowl of questionable cereal away from my place setting. "I've been eating very well at the restaurants, where the food is always fresh and properly prepared." Ashley looked up from her phone with an expression of mild annoyance. "Can you guys keep it down? I'm trying to record content about mindful morning routines, and all this negative energy is really affecting the vibe." I smiled at her with genuine amusement. Sorry, Ashley. I wouldn't want to interfere with your content creation. After breakfast, I drove to the Boulder location of Rose's Kitchen for my scheduled meeting with Maria Santos, the head chef who'd been instrumental in maintaining recipe consistency and quality standards across all 5 restaurants. Maria had started working with me when I'd opened the second location, and she'd become not just an employee, but a mentor and friend who understood both the technical and emotional aspects of building a restaurant business. Maria was in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and hands that showed the calluses and small scars that came from decades of professional cooking. She'd emigrated from Mexico as a teenager and worked her way through every position in restaurant kitchens before eventually becoming the kind of chef that other chefs respected and sought out for advice. When I'd hired her 3 years ago, Maria had been working for a high-end restaurant that was treating her like hired help, despite her obvious skills and experience. The owner had been taking credit for her menu innovations while paying her less than she was worth and denying her the recognition she deserved. The parallels to my own family situation hadn't been lost on either of us during our conversation the day before. "Mija," Maria said as we settled into her small office behind the Boulder kitchen, "you look different today. More focused, maybe. Did you figure out what you're going to do about your family situation?" I filled her in on my meetings with Lisa Chang and Jake Thompson, explaining the financial restructuring and the new policies I'd implemented regarding family access to the restaurants. Maria listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, as I described the systematic way Patricia and Ashley had been taking credit for work they'd never done while treating me like an unwanted burden. "You know what this reminds me of?" Maria said when I'd finished. "My grandmother used to tell a story about a woman who let her neighbors eat from her garden because she thought it was the neighborly thing to do. But the neighbors started taking more and more, and eventually they were taking the best vegetables while leaving weeds and criticism behind. Finally, my grandmother's friend built a fence around her garden. The neighbors complained that she was being selfish and unkind, but she told them, 'A garden can only feed people who respect what grows there.' The metaphor was perfect, and it crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. I'd been sharing the fruits of my labor with people who not only failed to appreciate them, but who actively disrespected both the work and the person who'd made their abundance possible. "Maria, I want to ask you something," I said. "Over the past few years, have you noticed Ashley or Patricia in the restaurants taking photos or videos for social media?" Maria's expression darkened slightly. "Oh yes, many times. The younger one, Ashley, she comes in with her phone and acts like she owns the place. She puts on aprons and stands behind the cooking stations, takes pictures with plates of food, interviews our real chefs like she's some kind of restaurant expert. The staff always asks me what to do, and I tell them to be polite but not to play along with whatever she's pretending." "Have you seen the posts she makes afterward?" I asked. "Some of them, yes. My daughter follows her on Instagram and shows me sometimes. It's ridiculous, Emma. She talks about developing recipes and managing operations and building the family restaurant empire. Complete lies, but she has thousands of people believing it." This confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't been able to verify directly. Ashley's social media persona wasn't just exaggerated or misleading, it was completely fabricated. She'd been using my restaurants as sets for an elaborate fiction about her own expertise and involvement in a business she'd never worked for. "What about Patricia?" I asked. "Have you seen her representing herself as involved in restaurant operations?" Maria nodded. "Not as much direct lying, but lots of suggestions and implications. She brings friends through for tours sometimes, and I hear her talking about our family's restaurants and the business we've built together. She acts like she's showing off something she owns rather than something her stepdaughter created." We spent another hour discussing the practical aspects of preventing future unauthorized social media content and ensuring that any public representation of Rose's Kitchen was accurate and authentic. Maria promised to brief all the staff members about the new policies and to personally intervene if Ashley or Patricia showed up for more photo sessions. "One more thing, mija," Maria said as I was preparing to leave. "Don't feel guilty about protecting what you've built. These people have been feeding off your success while poisoning your daily life. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is force people to face the truth about their own situation." My next stop was the corporate office space I rented in a small business complex near downtown Denver. I used this space for administrative work that required privacy and quiet concentration, away from the operational demands of running restaurant locations. Today, I wanted to conduct a comprehensive review of exactly how my family had been representing themselves in connection with my business success. I started with Ashley's Instagram account, systematically screenshotting every post that mentioned Rosa's Kitchen, claimed involvement in restaurant operations, or implied ownership of business decisions. The evidence was even more extensive than I'd realized. Over the past 18 months, Ashley had posted more than 40 pieces of content that falsely represented her role in my restaurants. Some posts showed her in chef's clothing, standing behind cooking stations with captions like, "Another day perfecting recipes in our family kitchens." Others featured her posing with plates of food, claiming to have created this new seasonal menu item for our downtown location. Several posts included videos of her interviewing actual Rosa's Kitchen employees, positioning herself as their supervisor, and asking them to describe how we work together to maintain our high standards. The most egregious posts involved Ashley, taking credit for business decisions and expansion plans. One post from 3 months ago showed her standing in front of the Aspen location with the caption, "So excited to announce the opening of our newest Rosa's Kitchen location. It's been months of hard work scouting the perfect spot and designing the space, but I think our Aspen customers are going to love what we've created here." The Aspen location had been my personal project for over a year. I'd identified the market opportunity, negotiated the lease, designed the interior layout, hired and trained the staff, and managed every aspect of the opening. Ashley had visited exactly once for a photo opportunity after the restaurant was already operational and successful. I created a comprehensive file documenting Ashley's false claims, organizing them by category: recipe development, restaurant management, business expansion, staff supervision, and overall ownership implications. The pattern was clear and systematic. She hadn't just exaggerated her involvement. She'd created an entirely fictional narrative about being a successful restaurateur. Next, I researched Patricia's public representations of her connection to Rosa's Kitchen. This required more detective work, since Patricia was more subtle in her approach and used venues like social media less frequently than Ashley. Instead, she'd been spreading her false narrative through social circles, community organizations, and local business networks. I found several online mentions of Patricia in connection with local women's business groups, where she'd been quoted as a successful entrepreneur and restaurant industry leader. One article from a Denver lifestyle magazine featured her in a piece about power couples balancing family and business, where she was described as co-managing the growing Rosa's Kitchen restaurant empire alongside her husband's investment portfolio. A search through local event listings revealed that Patricia had been invited to speak at multiple women's entrepreneurship events, business networking meetings, and community leadership workshops. The promotional materials for these events consistently described her as a restaurant industry executive and family business leader. The most disturbing discovery was an interview Patricia had given to a local business podcast 6 months ago. In the 20-minute conversation, she'd positioned herself as the experienced adult guiding a young person's career in the restaurant industry. She'd talked about mentoring Emma through the challenges of rapid business expansion and providing the strategic oversight that young entrepreneurs often lack. When the interviewer asked about her own background in the restaurant industry, Patricia had been deliberately vague, but heavily implied that she'd had extensive culinary training and business experience before focusing on family responsibilities. in recent years. She'd described her current role as handling the behind-the-scenes business operations while Emma manages the day-to-day restaurant activities. The interviewer and audience had clearly been impressed by Patricia's apparent expertise and experience. The podcast comments included praise for her wisdom and generous mentorship of young entrepreneurs. Several listeners had reached out asking for her advice on starting their own restaurant businesses. By late afternoon, I had documented a comprehensive pattern of false representation that went far beyond casual exaggeration or social media posturing. Both Patricia and Ashley had built public personas and social status based entirely on claiming credit for my work, my business decisions, and my success. They'd received recognition, speaking opportunities, and social connections based on achievements they'd had no role in creating. The irony was staggering. While feeding me spoiled food and treating me like hired help in private, they'd been publicly presenting themselves as successful business leaders who deserved respect and admiration for building the very restaurant empire that was funding their lifestyle. As I drove home that evening, I felt a mixture of anger and determination that was surprisingly energizing rather than exhausting. Tomorrow, the consequences of their choices would begin to unfold in ways they couldn't anticipate or control. Because while they'd been busy taking credit for my success, I'd been quietly building the foundation for their downfall. Their Part 5. First strategic move. The first real test of my new approach came 3 days later, when Patricia tried to make her usual monthly car payment and discovered that the family account had insufficient funds. I was in my room working on expansion plans for the restaurant business when I heard her voice echoing through the house, sharp with confusion and growing panic. David, come here immediately. Something's wrong with our bank account." I heard my father's footsteps in the hallway, followed by muffled conversation from downstairs that gradually grew louder and more agitated. Within minutes, they were both in the kitchen, their voices carrying clearly through the house as they tried to understand why their financial situation had suddenly changed. "The system says we're overdrawn," Patricia was saying, her voice tight with the kind of stress she usually reserved for major social embarrassments. "That's impossible. We had $25,000 deposited just last week, like always." "Let me see the account details," my father replied, his tone shifting from confused to concerned. "Maybe there's been some kind of banking error or identity theft situation." I could hear them scrolling through transaction records on someone's phone or computer, discussing automatic payments that had bounced and upcoming expenses they could no longer cover. The mortgage payment was due in 5 days. Ashley's car payment had already been rejected. Patricia's spa appointment charges had been declined. "David, this makes no sense," Patricia continued, her voice rising slightly. "The restaurant money should have been deposited automatically. There must be some kind of mistake." That's when I decided it was time to provide some clarity. I walked downstairs and found them both hunched over my father's laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by bank statements and credit card bills, their faces showing the kind of panic that comes from realizing your financial security isn't as solid as you'd believed. "Is everything okay?" I asked, settling into a chair across from them with the innocent expression of someone who genuinely wanted to help solve a problem. Patricia looked up at me with eyes that were already showing signs of strain. "Emma, thank goodness. We're having some kind of banking crisis. The automatic transfer from your restaurant account didn't go through this month, and now several of our payments have bounced. Do you know if there's been some kind of technical problem with your business banking?" It was fascinating to watch her struggle with the cognitive dissonance of the situation. She needed to ask for my help with a problem involving my money, but she couldn't quite bring herself to acknowledge that it was my money in the first place. Instead, she was framing it as a technical glitch that was affecting everyone equally. "Oh, that," I said, nodding as if suddenly remembering something minor. "I made some changes to my business financial structure. I'm redirecting capital toward expansion plans instead of family support. I thought I mentioned that I was going to be making some adjustments." The silence that followed was remarkable. I could see both my father and Patricia processing this information and trying to figure out exactly what it meant for their immediate financial situation. Patricia's face went through several distinct expressions: confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally the beginning of genuine alarm. "What? Do you mean redirecting capital?" my father asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Emma, that money has been part of our household budget for years. We have obligations and commitments based on that income." "I understand that," I replied calmly. "But it was never guaranteed income. It was discretionary business money that I was choosing to share with the family. Now I'm choosing to invest it in expanding Rosa's kitchen instead." Patricia's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching indignation. "Emma, you can't just make unilateral decisions that affect the entire family's financial stability. We've built our household budget around that income stream. Your father and I have made commitments and obligations based on the understanding that those resources would continue to be available." The audacity of that statement was breathtaking. Patricia was sitting in a kitchen paid for by my restaurant profits, wearing jewelry purchased with my money, living in a house whose mortgage I'd been covering, and she had the nerve to lecture me about making unilateral decisions with my own business revenue. "Patricia," I said, keeping my voice level and reasonable, "I think there might be some confusion about whose money we're discussing. Rosa's kitchen is my business. I built it using my mother's inheritance and my own work. The profits belong to me, and I get to decide how to allocate them." My father cleared his throat, obviously uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. "Emma, while that's technically true, family members support each other. We've always operated as a unit, sharing resources and responsibilities. Your success reflects well on all of us, and it's natural that the financial benefits would be shared as well." I looked at him with genuine curiosity. "Dad, what resources and responsibilities have you been sharing with my restaurant business? When was the last time you visited any of my locations? Have you ever reviewed a menu, met with suppliers, handled staffing issues, or contributed to business decisions in any way?" He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again as he realized he couldn't identify any specific contributions he'd made to my business success. Patricia jumped into the silence with her own attempt at justification. "Emma, family support each other in ways that go beyond direct business involvement. We've provided you with a stable home environment, emotional support during challenging times, and the security of knowing you have a family foundation to rely on. That kind of support has value, even if it's not measured in dollars and cents." I almost laughed at the description of moldy food and constant dismissal as emotional support and stable home environment. But instead, I decided to explore this line of reasoning further. "You're absolutely right about family support being valuable," I agreed. "So let's talk about the support I've been receiving. In the past month alone, you've served me spoiled food while everyone else ate fresh meals, dismissed my business achievements as little restaurant activities and hobbies, and allowed Ashley to publicly take credit for my work on social media. Is that the kind of family support you think justifies $25,000 per month?" Patricia's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, Ashley appeared in the kitchen doorway with her phone in hand, clearly having overheard enough of the conversation to understand that something significant was happening. "What's going on?" Ashley asked, looking between the three adults with an expression that was trying to appear concerned, but mostly looked annoyed that her content creation schedule was being interrupted by family drama. "Your stepsister has decided to cut off financial support to the family," Patricia said, her voice taking on the martyred tone she used when she wanted to position herself as the victim of other people's unreasonable behavior. "Apparently, the money that's been helping maintain our household isn't important enough to continue now that she's decided to expand her restaurant business." Ashley's eyes widened as she processed this information. "Wait, what? Emma, you can't just stop supporting the family. What about my car payments? What about college tuition? What about all the things we need that money for? I looked at Ashley with the same calm expression I'd been maintaining throughout this conversation. Ashley, I'm curious about something. What exactly do you think you've contributed to earn that financial support? She stared at me as if the question didn't make sense. I'm family. That's what families do. They support each other. Okay, I said. Let's explore that. How have you been supporting me? How have you been contributing to the family or to my business success? Ashley glanced at Patricia as if looking for guidance on how to answer. I've been promoting the restaurants on social media, building brand awareness and customer engagement. That's valuable marketing work. Interesting, I replied. Let's talk about that marketing work. Ashley, when you post photos of yourself in chef's clothing claiming to have developed recipes for Rose's Kitchen, is that accurate? Her face went slightly pale. I mean, I've contributed ideas and suggestions. It's not like I'm lying about everything. When you posted last month about opening our newest location in Aspen and months of hard work scouting the perfect spot, was that accurate? Did you scout locations or participate in opening the Aspen restaurant? The silence stretched for several seconds before Ashley finally muttered, I visited after it opened. Once, I clarified, for photos. After I had already done all the work of identifying the market, negotiating the lease, designing the space, hiring staff, and managing the opening. Patricia tried to regain control of the conversation. Emma, you're being unnecessarily harsh. Ashley has been promoting the family business to her followers. That kind of social media exposure has value, even if the specific details aren't always completely precise. Family business, I repeated. Patricia, can you show me any legal document that establishes Rose's Kitchen as a family business? Any partnership agreement? Any shared ownership structure? Any official record that indicates anyone other than me has ownership stakes or decision-making authority? Neither Patricia nor my father responded, because they both knew the answer. There were no such documents because Rose's Kitchen had never been a family business. It had always been my business, funded by my inheritance and built through my work. Let me make something clear, I continued. Rose's Kitchen is not a family business. It's my business. I own 100% of all 5 locations. I make all business decisions. I'm responsible for all profits and losses. The money I've been transferring to support this household wasn't family income. It was charitable giving. Ashley's phone, which she'd been holding throughout this conversation, suddenly buzzed with notifications. She glanced down at the screen, and her expression shifted to something approaching panic. Oh no, she whispered. Emma, did you call the restaurants about me? I looked at her with innocent curiosity. What do you mean? I just got a text from the manager at the downtown location. He says I'm not allowed to film there anymore without your personal approval, and all my upcoming content shoots are canceled. That's correct, I confirmed. I've implemented new policies regarding unauthorized promotional activities at all Rose's Kitchen locations. Anyone claiming to represent the business needs proper authorization and approval. Ashley stared at me with growing horror as she realized the implications. Emma, I have brand partnerships based on restaurant content. I have sponsored posts scheduled. Companies are paying me to feature Rose's Kitchen products and experiences. If I can't access the restaurants, I can't fulfill my contracts. Ashley, I said gently, those companies are paying you based on the false belief that you have some kind of official role in restaurant operations. Don't you think they deserve to know the truth about your actual relationship to the business? Patricia had been growing increasingly agitated throughout this conversation, and she finally exploded with the kind of anger she usually kept carefully hidden beneath her polished social exterior. Emma Rodriguez, you are being selfish, ungrateful, and cruel. This family has given you everything. We've supported your dreams, encouraged your interests, and shared in your success. And now, The moment you have a little bit of money, you decide you're too good for the people who raised you and loved you. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Patricia's version of reality was so completely disconnected from my actual experience that I almost didn't know how to respond. But then I remembered the moldy pasta, the years of dismissive comments, the systematic appropriation of my achievements, and the treatment that had made me feel like an unwanted stranger in my own family. "Patricia," I said, my voice still calm but carrying a new edge of steel. "Let's talk about the support and love you've shown me. In the past month, you've served me spoiled food while everyone else ate gourmet meals. You've dismissed my business, achievements as hobbies, and suggested I don't understand the value of money. You've allowed Ashley to publicly take credit for my work while treating me like hired help in my own home. You've misrepresented yourself to the community as a restaurant industry leader while I actually run the restaurants. Is that your definition of family love and support?" My father had been sitting quietly through most of this exchange, but now he seemed to realize that his family's financial crisis required him to take some kind of position. "Emma," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I understand. You're upset about some family dynamics, but cutting off financial support is an extreme response. We can work through whatever issues exist, but destroying the family's economic stability isn't the way to solve interpersonal problems." I looked at this man who'd raised me, who'd once been my biggest supporter and cheerleader, who'd promised my dying mother that he'd always believe in my dreams. Now he was characterizing my refusal to fund other people's lifestyle as destroying the family's economic stability. "Dad," I said, "if the family's economic stability depends entirely on my business profits, then maybe the problem isn't that I've stopped sharing them. Maybe the problem is that no one else in this family has built anything sustainable or valuable enough to support the lifestyle you've all become accustomed to." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. Ashley was staring at her phone screen as if willing the restaurant access restrictions to disappear. My father was studying his hands as if they contained answers to questions he didn't want to ask. Finally, Patricia spoke again, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Fine, Emma. You want to be selfish and vindictive? You want to punish your family for not treating you like some kind of princess? Go ahead, but don't expect us to pretend. We're grateful when you decide you want to be part of this family again." I stood up from the kitchen table, looking around at these three people who'd been living off my success while systematically undermining my confidence and stealing credit for my achievements. "Patricia," I said, "I don't want to punish anyone. I just want to stop rewarding people who treat me badly while taking credit for my work. If that makes me selfish, then I'm comfortable being selfish." I walked toward the kitchen doorway, then paused and turned back to face them one more time. "Oh, and Ashley? You might want to start drafting some corrections for your social media accounts. Your followers deserve to know the truth about your actual role in Rose's kitchen operations. I'd hate for them to feel deceived by misleading information." As I climbed the stairs toward my bedroom, I could hear the conversation resuming behind me. Voices urgent and worried as they began to calculate exactly how much their lifestyle was about to change. Patricia was already talking about temporary budget adjustments and finding alternative income sources. Ashley was frantically typing on her phone, probably trying to figure out how to maintain her influencer status without access to the restaurant content that had built her following. My father was asking questions about their actual monthly expenses and available income, apparently realizing for the first time in 3 years that he'd lost track of where their money actually came from. In my room, I opened my laptop and began reviewing the expansion plans Jake Thompson and I had developed for the 6th Rose's Kitchen location. With an additional $300,000 per year available for reinvestment, we could move much more aggressively on growth opportunities. The Durango location Jake had identified could open within 6 months. The Grand Junction possibility could follow within a year. For the first time in months, I felt excited about the future instead of drained by family obligations. My mother's dream of a successful restaurant business was growing into something even bigger than she'd imagined, and I was finally free to pursue that growth without subsidizing people who saw my success as their entitlement rather than my achievement. The phone calls and text messages started within hours. Patricia reached out to her sister in California, explaining their sudden financial crisis and asking for advice about managing difficult family members. Ashley contacted several of her influencer friends, seeking guidance about maintaining brand partnerships when access to content locations became restricted. My father called his financial advisor, probably trying to understand why his investment portfolio wasn't generating enough income to support their household expenses. But none of them called me. None of them knocked on my bedroom door to apologize for years of dismissive treatment or to acknowledge that their comfortable lifestyle had been built on my generosity rather than their own achievements. They were all focused on solving their immediate financial problems without addressing the underlying relationship issues that had created this situation. That was fine with me. I'd spent 3 years trying to buy their respect and affection with money, and all I'd gotten in return was moldy food and stolen credit for my achievements. Now they could figure out how to respect and support each other without my business profits to cushion their choices. As I worked on restaurant expansion plans late into the evening, I could hear the family crisis unfolding downstairs. Phone, calls to extended relatives, internet searches for emergency loans, and fast income opportunities, heated discussions about which expenses could be eliminated and which were absolutely necessary. The beautiful thing about natural consequences is that they teach lessons more effectively than any argument or confrontation ever could. Patricia, Ashley, and my father were about to discover exactly what their lifestyle actually cost and where the money to pay for it had really been coming from. And I was about to discover what it felt like to build something amazing without having to share the credit or the profits with people who'd never understood their value in the first place. The transformation of the Rodriguez household happened faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within 2 weeks of my financial restructuring, the carefully maintained facade of upper-class stability began cracking in ways that revealed just how precarious their situation had always been. The mortgage payment bounced first, triggering a series of automated late fees and penalty charges that Patricia discovered when she tried to use her credit card at her favorite boutique and found it declined. Ashley's influencer career imploded even more dramatically. Without access to Rosa's kitchen locations for content creation, she scrambled to fulfill existing brand partnerships using old photos and recycled material. But her followers weren't stupid. They noticed immediately when her daily restaurant management posts started featuring the same backgrounds and angles week after week. Comments began questioning why she never showed new menu development or restaurant operations anymore. The final blow to Ashley's social media empire came when one of her sponsored partners, a luxury kitchenware company, decided to verify her credentials before renewing their contract. A simple Google search revealed that Rosa's Kitchen had no public records of Ashley Rodriguez in any management capacity. When they contacted the restaurants directly to confirm her role, Jake Thompson politely informed them that Ashley had never been employed by Rosa's Kitchen in any capacity and was not authorized to represent the business. The company's response was swift and public. They posted a statement on their own social media channels explaining that they were terminating their partnership with Ashley due to misrepresentation of professional credentials and business affiliations. The post went viral in the influencer community, with thousands of comments from people sharing their own experiences with fake credentials and manufactured expertise. Ashley's follower count plummeted from 47,000 to 12,000 within a week. Brand partnerships evaporated. Speaking engagement invitations were rescinded. The carefully constructed persona that had defined her identity and income for the past 2 years collapsed entirely, leaving behind a 19-year-old with no real skills, no legitimate experience, and no idea how to support herself. Patricia's Social standing suffered equally devastating damage, though it took slightly longer to unfold. The women's business organizations where she'd been positioned as a successful entrepreneur began asking uncomfortable questions when other members started fact-checking her background. Someone had looked up the business registration records for Rose's Kitchen and discovered that Patricia Rodriguez wasn't listed anywhere in the corporate structure. The business podcast, where Patricia had been interviewed 6 months earlier, issued a public correction, acknowledging that their guest had misrepresented her role in restaurant industry operations and apologizing to listeners who might have been misled by the interview content. The podcast host, clearly embarrassed by the deception, mentioned that they were implementing new verification procedures to prevent similar situations in the future. Local business magazines that had featured Patricia in articles about women entrepreneurs quietly removed her from their online archives. The Women's Entrepreneurship Conference that had invited her to speak sent a formal letter disinviting her from their upcoming event, citing concerns about speaker credentials and authenticity. But the most humiliating revelation came when Patricia's book club friends, the same women who'd been enjoying her elaborate appetizers funded by my restaurant profits, started piecing together the timeline of her claims versus the reality of her stepdaughter's actual business ownership. Someone had done research and discovered that Rose's Kitchen had been founded when Patricia's stepdaughter was 18 years old, 3 years before Patricia had even married into the family. The whispered conversations at country club luncheons and charity fundraisers were devastating to Patricia's carefully cultivated reputation. People who'd once sought her advice about business ventures now avoided her at social events. Friends who'd once competed for invitations to her elegant dinner parties stopped returning her phone calls. My father's situation was perhaps the most pathetic of all, because he seemed genuinely shocked to discover that his investment portfolio had been losing money for years, while his household expenses had been covered by his daughter's business success. The financial advisor he'd been paying substantial fees to manage his investments had been delivering consistently poor returns while charging premium prices for their services. When Dad finally calculated their actual household expenses against his real income, the numbers were sobering. Without my monthly contributions, the Rodriguez family's available income was approximately $6,000 per month, while their fixed expenses exceeded $11,000 monthly. The mortgage alone consumed nearly half of Dad's actual earnings. The luxury SUV lease payments, country club memberships, designer clothing budgets, spa appointments, and elaborate grocery bills that had defined their lifestyle were all completely unsustainable without external financial support. They'd been living like people who earned $200,000 annually while actually earning less than $75,000. The forced downsizing began immediately. Patricia's Mercedes was the first casualty, returned to the dealership when they couldn't make the lease payments. Ashley's red Camaro followed shortly afterward. The country club membership was canceled. The house cleaning service was terminated. Patricia's weekly spa appointments became a distant memory. Within a month, they'd listed the Lakewood mansion for sale and begun looking at modest apartments and townhouses that might fit within their actual budget. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were essentially being evicted from a house that my restaurant profits had been paying for while they treated me like unwanted hired help. But the most satisfying development was watching them try to maintain their social relationships while their financial reality became increasingly obvious to their community. Patricia's book club friends noticed when she stopped hosting meetings and started suggesting they meet at coffee shops instead of her home. Ashley's college friends realized something had changed when she stopped picking up dinner tabs and started declining invitations to expensive restaurants and events. The family's desperate attempts to find alternative income sources were both pathetic and revealing. Patricia applied for positions at several high-end retailers, apparently believing that her social connections and fashion sense qualified her for management roles in luxury stores. When those applications were rejected, she lowered her expectations to entry-level sales positions, where her lack of recent work experience became an obvious handicap. Ashley tried to rebuild her influencer career by pivoting to lifestyle content that didn't require restaurant access, but her audience could tell that something fundamental had changed. Her posts about budget-friendly fashion finds and affordable wellness routines rang hollow coming from someone who'd previously built her brand around luxury experiences and family wealth. Dad attempted to increase his consulting income by taking on additional clients, but his track record of poor investment advice made it difficult to attract new business. Potential clients who researched his background discovered the gap between his lifestyle and his professional results, leading to uncomfortable questions about where his apparent success had actually originated. The most dramatic moment came when Patricia tried to leverage her relationship with me to maintain access to some of her social privileges. She approached me one evening as I was reviewing expansion plans for the 7th Rose's Kitchen location, having secured another prime site in Telluride that would cater to the ski resort clientele. "Emma," she said, her voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before, something between desperation and forced humility. "I need to ask you something important. The Harrison Foundation Gala is next month, and I've already committed to attending, as part of the Women's Leadership Committee. It would be extremely embarrassing for me to back out now. Could you possibly help with the ticket cost? It's only $1,500, and it would mean so much to me professionally." I looked up from my laptop, genuinely amazed by the request. Patricia was asking me to pay $1,500 so she could attend a social event where she would presumably continue misrepresenting her connection to my business success. "Patricia," I said calmly, "help me understand something. You want me to pay for you to attend an event where you'll likely continue telling people that you're involved in restaurant industry leadership?" She shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that her request had some obvious ethical problems. "I wouldn't misrepresent anything. I just need to maintain certain professional relationships that are important for my future career prospects." "Your future career prospects in what industry?" I asked. "What exactly are you qualified to do professionally?" The question hung in the air between us, highlighting the fundamental problem with Patricia's situation. She'd spent the past 3 years building a social identity around business success she'd never achieved, developing relationships based on expertise she didn't possess, and cultivating a reputation for accomplishments that belonged to someone else. "I have management experience," she said defensively. "I've been handling household operations and family financial coordination. Those are transferable skills." "You've been spending my money," I corrected. "That's not management experience. That's not financial coordination. That's consumption funded by someone else's business profits." Patricia's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but she couldn't argue with the accuracy of my assessment. For 3 years, her primary activity had been converting my restaurant revenue into lifestyle expenses while taking public credit for the business success that generated that revenue. "Emma, please," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality that I'd never heard before. "I know things have been difficult between us, but I'm trying to rebuild my career and establish some independence. I just need a little help with this transition period." I closed my laptop and looked at her directly. "Patricia, you want help rebuilding a career based on false credentials and stolen credit for other people's achievements. You want me to fund your continued misrepresentation of your connection to my business success. Does that seem reasonable to you?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again as she realized there was no good answer to that question. Finally, she said, "What do you want from me, Emma? What would it take for us to find some way to work together again?" It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that I'd ever heard from Patricia, though it still fell far short of accepting responsibility for years of systematic disrespect and appropriation of my achievements. "I want honesty," I said. "I want you to stop taking credit for work you've never done. I want you to stop serving me spoiled food while everyone else eats fresh meals. I want you to acknowledge that Rose's Kitchen is my business, built with my money and my work, and that you've never contributed anything meaningful to its success." Patricia stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her options. Admitting the truth would mean acknowledging that her entire social identity for the past 3 years had been built on lies. But refusing to admit the truth meant accepting that her comfortable lifestyle was permanently over. "Fine," she said finally, her voice tight with resentment. "You're right. I never built the restaurants. I never contributed to your business success. I took credit for achievements that weren't mine. Are you happy now?" It wasn't exactly a heartfelt apology, but it was an admission of facts that she'd been denying for years. More importantly, it was acknowledgement that the power dynamic between us had permanently shifted. "I'm not interested in your happiness or unhappiness, Patricia," I said. "I'm interested in honesty and respect. If you can manage both of those things consistently, we might be able to have a functional relationship. If not, you're welcome to figure out your career and social life without any involvement from me." The conversation ended there, with Patricia walking away to face the reality that her comfortable life had been permanently disrupted by her own choices and behavior. She'd had 3 years to treat me with basic respect and acknowledge my contributions to the family's well-being. Instead, she'd chosen humiliation and appropriation, and now she was facing the natural consequences of those choices. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. The Rodriguez family had moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a middle-income neighborhood. Patricia had eventually found employment as a sales associate at a department store, earning $12 per hour while trying to rebuild some semblance of financial stability. Ashley had transferred to a community college and taken a part-time job at a coffee shop, finally learning what it meant to earn her own money through actual work. My father had been forced to confront the reality that his investment strategies had been consistently unsuccessful, and that his lifestyle had been funded entirely by his daughter's business success. He'd downsized his consulting practice and began focusing on smaller, more realistic clients whose modest portfolios matched his actual capabilities. Meanwhile, Rosa's Kitchen had expanded to 8 locations across Colorado, with plans for additional restaurants in Utah and New Mexico. The cookbook I'd written featuring my mother's recipes and my own innovations had become a regional bestseller. The catering division was booking events 6 months in advance, and my personal net worth had grown substantially now that I wasn't subsidizing other people's lifestyles. The most satisfying aspect of the entire situation wasn't the family's downfall or my business success, though both were gratifying in their own ways. The most satisfying part was the complete restoration of honesty to my daily life. No more moldy food disguised as family dinner. No more stolen credit for my achievements. No more subsidizing people who treated me like hired help while living off my success. I'd learned something valuable about the difference between family relationships based on mutual respect versus family relationships based on financial convenience. When the money stopped flowing, the fake respect and artificial gratitude disappeared as well, revealing the authentic relationships that remained. Maria Santos, my head chef, had become more of a family member than the people who shared my last name. Jake Thompson and his wife regularly invited me to their home for genuine family dinners, where everyone contributed something meaningful to the conversation and the meal preparation. Lisa Chang had become not just my attorney, but a trusted advisor who understood both my business goals and my personal values. The restaurant staff across all 8 locations had created a work environment that felt more like home than the house I'd grown up in. These were people who appreciated excellent food, who understood the work required to create something meaningful, who celebrated success without trying to steal credit for achievements they hadn't earned. On the 1-year anniversary of my financial restructuring decision, I organized a celebration dinner at the flagship Rosa's Kitchen location in downtown Denver. The guest list included everyone who'd supported my business growth and personal development over the past year. Maria prepared a special menu featuring updated versions of my mother's original recipes, alongside new dishes I'd developed for the upcoming cookbook. As I looked around the dining room filled with people who'd earned their places at this table through genuine relationships and mutual respect, I realized that I'd finally created the kind of family my mother would have been proud of. Not a family based on blood relations or legal obligations, but a family based on shared values, authentic support, and honest appreciation for each other's contributions. The Rodriguez family was notably absent from the celebration, though they weren't explicitly excluded. They simply hadn't earned invitations through their behavior and choices over the past year. Patricia was probably working her evening shift at the department store. Ashley was likely studying for community college exams or working her coffee shop job. Dad was perhaps reviewing financial statements that finally reflected his actual capabilities, rather than inflated expectations. I didn't feel sorry for them. They'd been given every opportunity to be part of something genuine and meaningful, and they'd chosen manipulation and appropriation instead. Now they were learning to build their own success through their own efforts, which was probably the most valuable lesson anyone could have taught them. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give people is the opportunity to discover what they're actually capable of when they can't rely on other people's achievements to support their lifestyle and social status. My family was finally learning to cook their own meals, earn their own money, and build their own reputations based on their own work. And I was finally free to build something amazing without having to share the credit or the profits with people who'd never understood their value in the first place. 2 years after my decision to reclaim control of my finances and my life, I stood in the kitchen of Rosa's Kitchen number 12, watching the evening prep crew work with the kind of synchronized efficiency that only comes from months of training and genuine passion for their craft. The Vail location had exceeded all our projections, drawing both locals and tourists who appreciated the mountain-influenced variations on my mother's traditional recipes that we'd developed specifically for the Colorado ski country market. The expansion had been remarkable. What started as redirecting $25,000 monthly from family support had transformed into a restaurant empire that now employed over 300 people across 4 states. The Utah locations in Park City and Moab had opened to immediate success. The New Mexico restaurants in Santa Fe and Taos had become destination dining spots that food critics were calling essential stops for serious food lovers. Each location maintained the core identity of Rosa's Kitchen, while adapting to local tastes and ingredients in ways that honored both my mother's vision and the communities we served. But the restaurants were only part of what had grown from that decision to stop feeding people who didn't appreciate the meal. The cookbook series had expanded to 3 volumes, each one climbing bestseller lists and winning awards from culinary organizations across the country. The catering division now handled major events throughout the Southwest, including celebrity weddings and corporate retreats that specifically requested our services. The Rosa's Kitchen brand had become synonymous with authenticity, quality, and the kind of food that made people feel genuinely cared for. The financial transformation was staggering when I looked at the numbers objectively. My personal net worth had increased by over 400% in 2 years. The business generated sufficient cash flow to fund aggressive expansion while maintaining the high-quality standards that had built our reputation. Most importantly, every dollar earned reflected genuine value created through excellent food and service rather than money extracted from family relationships based on obligation and guilt. Standing in that Vail kitchen, I thought about the parallel transformation that had occurred in my personal life over the same period. The house in Lakewood that had never felt like home was now occupied by strangers who'd purchased it from my father at a significant loss when he could no longer maintain the mortgage payments. The Rodriguez family had been scattered to more modest living situations that matched their actual earning capacity rather than their social aspirations. Patricia had eventually found steady employment managing the customer service department at a local insurance company, a position that utilized her organizational skills and attention to detail without requiring the fabricated business credentials she'd once claimed. Her social circle had naturally contracted to include people who appreciated her for her actual qualities rather than her perceived wealth and influence. The country club memberships and designer shopping expeditions were distant memories, replaced by more authentic relationships and activities that fit within her real budget. Ashley had surprised everyone, including herself, by discovering genuine talents and interests once she was forced to build something real instead of living off stolen credit and family money. Community college had led to a transfer to a 4-year university where she was studying hospitality management with a focus on sustainable tourism. She'd even reached out to me several months ago, not asking for money or opportunities, but simply to acknowledge that she understood now what real work looked like, and to apologize for the years she'd spent taking credit for mine. The conversation with Ashley had been awkward but honest, taking place at a neutral coffee shop where we could speak without the emotional baggage of family dynamics. She looked different than she had during her influencer days, less polished but more genuine, wearing clothes that were clearly affordable rather than designer, but that seemed to fit her personality better than the expensive costumes she'd once used to maintain her false image. "Emma," she'd said, stirring her coffee nervously, "I know this is probably too little too late, but I need to tell you how sorry I am for everything I did. I was so caught up in the social media game and the attention it brought that I convinced myself the lies were just creative storytelling. But they weren't stories. They were your achievements, your hard work, your success that I was stealing and claiming as my own." The apology had felt genuine in a way that Patricia's grudging admissions never had. Ashley seemed to understand, not just that she'd been caught, but that her behavior had been fundamentally wrong regardless of whether anyone had discovered it. She'd faced real consequences for her choices and learned actual lessons about the difference between earned success and borrowed status. "I've been working in restaurants for the past year," Ashley had continued, "starting as a server and working my way up to shift supervisor. It's hard work, much harder than I ever realized when I was pretending to be involved in restaurant management. The people who do this job well deserve so much more respect than I ever gave them." That conversation had marked a turning point in our relationship, not toward rebuilding a close family bond, but toward mutual respect between two adults who understood each other's strengths and limitations. Ashley had stopped asking for things she hadn't earned and started building things she could legitimately claim ownership of. My father's journey had been more complicated and ultimately more tragic. The revelation that his lifestyle had been entirely dependent on his daughter's financial support, while his own investments consistently lost money, had shattered his sense of identity in ways that were difficult to rebuild. He'd spent decades believing he was a successful businessman and financial expert, only to discover that his actual track record was one of consistent poor judgment and inflated self-assessment. The downsizing had been hardest on him, not just financially, but psychologically. Moving from the Lakewood mansion to a modest apartment meant confronting daily reminders that his perceived success had been an illusion. His consulting business had dwindled to almost nothing as word spread through his professional network about the gap between his lifestyle and his actual results. Potential clients weren't interested in financial advice from someone whose own investments had required his daughter's restaurant profits to maintain appearances. But the most difficult aspect for my father had been acknowledging his role in enabling Patricia's treatment of me over the years. He'd chosen to maintain peace with his new wife rather than protect his daughter from systematic disrespect and humiliation. When he could no longer deny the pattern of behavior, the guilt seemed to overwhelm his ability to rebuild our relationship in any meaningful way. Our occasional conversations were stilted and uncomfortable, filled with his attempts to explain decisions that couldn't really be explained or justified. He wanted forgiveness without accountability, reconciliation without addressing the fundamental issues that had damaged our relationship. It was perhaps the saddest casualty of the entire situation, but also the most necessary one for my own emotional health and future relationships. The contrast with the family I'd built through the restaurant business couldn't have been more stark. Maria Santos had become not just my head chef, but my closest advisor and friend. Someone whose wisdom about both cooking and life had shaped my approach to every major decision over the past 2 years. When I'd needed guidance about expanding into new markets, Maria's insights about maintaining quality while scaling operations had been invaluable. When I'd struggled with the emotional aftermath of cutting ties with my birth family, her perspective on choosing relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation had helped me navigate that difficult transition. Jake Thompson had evolved from restaurant manager to business partner, earning a small ownership stake in the company through his contributions to our expansion strategy and operational excellence. The profit-sharing arrangement we'd developed meant that his success was directly tied to the overall success of Rose's Kitchen, creating the kind of aligned incentives that made business relationships sustainable and rewarding for everyone involved. Lisa Chang had expanded her legal practice partly based on the success of our business relationship, specializing in helping entrepreneurs protect their intellectual property and business interests from family conflicts and fraudulent claims. She'd become something of an expert in the legal issues that arise when family members misrepresent their involvement in successful businesses, and she frequently spoke at conferences about the importance of clear documentation and boundaries in family business relationships. The extended Rose's Kitchen family now included dozens of employees across 12 locations who understood that their success was connected to providing genuine value to customers rather than exploiting personal relationships for financial gain. The culture we'd built emphasized accountability, authenticity, and the kind of pride and craftsmanship that my mother had instilled in me from an early age. The most meaningful recognition of what we'd accomplished came when the James Beard Foundation invited me to participate in their annual awards ceremony, not as a nominee, but as a featured speaker about building sustainable restaurant businesses while maintaining authentic cultural connections. The opportunity to stand on that stage and talk about my mother's recipes, her dreams, and the lessons she'd taught me about treating food and people with respect felt like the culmination of everything I'd been working toward since that first small storefront 7 years earlier. The speech I gave that night focused on the importance of knowing the difference between sharing success and having success stolen from you. I talked about the years I'd spent trying to buy family approval, with money that should have been invested in growth and innovation. I described the moment I realized that feeding people who didn't appreciate the meal was not generosity, but enablement of their worst impulses. My mother taught me that cooking is an act of love, I said to the audience of chefs, restaurant owners, and food industry professionals. But love requires respect from both sides. When you're serving your best efforts to people who respond with criticism, appropriation, and demands for more without gratitude, you're not showing love. You're showing fear. Fear that you're not worthy of appreciation. Fear that your contributions don't have value. Fear that saying no will mean losing relationships that aren't actually based on genuine connection. The response to that speech was overwhelming, with dozens of people approaching me afterward to share their own stories about family members, business partners, or romantic relationships where they'd been giving more than they received while being made to feel selfish for wanting basic respect and acknowledgement. The themes resonated far beyond the restaurant industry, touching on fundamental questions about self-worth, boundaries, and the difference between supporting people and enabling their destructive behavior. 6 months after the James Beard ceremony, I received a phone call that brought the entire journey full circle. A Food Network executive wanted to discuss a television show concept based on my restaurants and my story of building a business empire while navigating complex family dynamics. The proposed show would follow the operations of several Rose's Kitchen locations, while exploring the broader themes of authenticity, cultural heritage, and family relationships in the food industry. The most interesting aspect of the television opportunity was that it would potentially reach millions of viewers with the same message I'd been sharing with smaller audiences, that you don't have to accept disrespect in exchange for maintaining relationships. That success built on genuine value creation is more sustainable than success based on exploitation or deception, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling other people's worst behavior. As I considered the television offer, I thought about how different my life had become since that evening when Patricia had served me moldy pasta while everyone else enjoyed fresh lobster. The decision to stop accepting that treatment had triggered a cascade of changes that transformed not just my financial situation, but my entire approach to relationships, business, and personal growth. The Rodriguez family mansion had been replaced by a beautiful modern home in the foothills outside Denver, designed specifically for my lifestyle and needs, rather than purchased to impress people whose approval I'd been desperately seeking. The house featured a professional-grade kitchen where I could experiment with new recipes, a home office where I could manage the business empire without interruption, and guest rooms for the chosen family members who'd earned places in my personal life through their character and actions rather than their genetic connections. The contrast between my current dinner table and the one where I'd been served spoiled food was remarkable in every way. The people who gathered in my dining room were there because we enjoyed each other's company and respected each other's contributions to our shared experiences. The food was always fresh, carefully prepared, and offered with genuine generosity, rather than calculated manipulation. The conversations were honest, supportive, and focused on building each other up rather than competing for status or credit. Most importantly, no one at my table was taking credit for achievements they hadn't earned or living off success they hadn't contributed to creating. Everyone present had built something meaningful in their own lives, whether through their work, at Rose's Kitchen, their own businesses, or their contributions to our community in other ways. The television show ultimately became another extension of the Rose's Kitchen brand, reaching audiences who appreciated stories about authenticity triumphing over artifice, genuine relationships overcoming exploitation, and the power of choosing dignity over convenience. The success of the show led to additional opportunities that continued expanding the platform for sharing my mother's recipes and values with people who understood their worth. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of everything that had grown from my decision to stop feeding people who didn't appreciate the meal was the simplicity of it all. I hadn't needed elaborate revenge schemes or dramatic confrontations. I hadn't needed to destroy anyone or seek public vindication for years of mistreatment. I'd simply stopped participating in relationships that were harmful to my well-being and redirected my energy toward people and projects that appreciated what I had to offer. The natural consequences of that choice had taught everyone involved more about respect, gratitude, and genuine success than any argument or intervention could have accomplished. The people who'd been taking advantage of my generosity had been forced to develop their own capabilities and discover what they were actually worth when they couldn't rely on other people's achievements. And I'd been freed to build something extraordinary with people who understood that real families are created through mutual support and authentic appreciation rather than accident of birth or marriage. Standing in that Vail kitchen 2 years later, watching my carefully trained staff prepare meals that would bring joy and nourishment to hundreds of customers that evening, I finally understood what my mother had meant when she'd talked about food being an expression of love. Love doesn't mean accepting mistreatment or enabling bad behavior. Love means creating something beautiful and sharing it with people who can recognize its value and respond with gratitude rather than demands for more. The moldy pasta had been the beginning of my real education about the difference between feeding people and nourishing them. Now every plate that left every Rose's Kitchen location carried with it the lessons I'd learned about dignity, authenticity, and the power of knowing your own worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.